Donald Trump spent much of his transition period making headlines, and not always in a good way. His proposals to expand U.S. territory sparked controversy, especially among NATO allies. But one idea stood out the most: his plan to buy Greenland from Denmark. And he didn't just float the idea during the transition, he doubled down on it the moment he took office. Now, at first glance, the idea of America buying Greenland seems outlandish. But when you step back and look at history, it starts to make a lot more sense. The Arctic has long been a battleground for global influence, and the US has a track record of acquiring land in this region during times of heightened geopolitical tensions. Trump's proposal fits within this long-standing pattern. It's about countering growing Russian and Chinese ambitions in an area crucial to Washington's strategic interests. And here's the bigger picture. Great powers are once again racing to control key trade routes, strategic islands, and valuable resources in the Arctic. This isn't just about Greenland. It's part of a much larger power struggle, a warning sign of rising tensions and global competition. But just like those before him, Trump might soon realize that buying the Arctic isn't as simple as it sounds. Let's rewind to 1865. The US had just emerged from the Civil War and was looking to expand its global influence. At the same time, Russia, still reeling from its defeat in the Crimean War, was searching for ways to counterbalance British power in the Pacific. This alignment of interests set the stage for one of the most significant land deals in American history. In 1867, the US purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. The deal wasn't just about acquiring new land, it was a strategic move. Both nations had a common adversary in Britain, and for Russia, selling Alaska helped reduce British influence while offloading a distant and difficult-to-defend colony. For the US, it opened up access to the Pacific and positioned Washington as a growing power in the Arctic. But this was just the beginning. After securing Alaska, President Andrew Johnson and his Secretary of State, William Seward, set their sights on even more territory. They considered purchasing Greenland and Iceland from Denmark, believing these islands could serve as valuable military outposts. Denmark, weakened after its defeat in the Second Schleswig War, was in a vulnerable position. Seward had already initiated discussions about acquiring Danish Caribbean islands, so expanding this effort to Greenland and Iceland seemed like a logical next step. However, despite serious negotiations, the plan hit a roadblock. Congress, controlled by Republicans skeptical of such an expansion, refused to back the purchase. But that didn't mean American interest in Greenland disappeared. Fast forward to 1910, and history started repeating itself. President William Howard Taft's administration once again explored the idea of buying Greenland. This time, the motivation was clear: Greenland's strategic location and growing importance as a source of critical resources. The US and Denmark even discussed potential deals, including a land swap involving US territories in the Philippines. But as tensions in Europe escalated and World War I loomed, negotiations stalled, and Greenland remained in Danish hands. Meanwhile, the Arctic was becoming a focus for other global powers. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the newly formed Soviet Union sought to strengthen its Arctic presence by purchasing mining rights on the Svalbard archipelago, also known as Spitsbergen. Just 400 miles from Russia's northern coast, these islands were rich in natural resources and strategically positioned at the gateway to the North Atlantic. Rather than seizing territory by force, the Soviets took a different approach. In 1927, when a Dutch company operating in Svalbard struggled with the extreme Arctic conditions, the Soviets stepped in and bought out their stake. Then in 1932, they did it again, purchasing a Swedish-owned coal mine on another part of the island. These strategic acquisitions allowed the USSR to establish a foothold in the Arctic, securing vital resources while bolstering their military and economic interests. As the world edged closer to another major conflict, it was clear that the Arctic was more than just frozen wasteland. It was a key battleground for influence, resources, and security. And just like the Soviets before him, Trump's renewed interest in Greenland isn't just about expanding US territory. It's about making sure America stays ahead in an increasingly competitive Arctic race. As the Soviets predicted, the Arctic's strategic importance only grew as World War II loomed. When Germany occupied Norway in 1940 and launched its invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the icy region of Svalbard became a flashpoint in the war. The US was sending crucial Arctic convoys to supply the Soviet war effort, and these convoys passed right by this critical territory. The Nazis, eager to disrupt the supply chain, quickly moved in, occupying Svalbard and setting up intelligence stations to track weather patterns, data that was essential for planning attacks on Allied ships. To counter this threat, the Allies struck back, launching attacks on these Nazi weather stations. This marked the beginning of what became known as the Weather War, a battle for control over crucial meteorological intelligence. And it didn't stop at Svalbard. The war over weather data soon extended to Greenland, once again pulling the US deeper into Arctic geopolitics. Greenland had long been on Washington's radar, but now, it wasn't just about strategic positioning, it was about resources. The island was home to cryolite, a rare earth mineral essential for producing military aircraft in the US and Canada. Germany recognized this too and ramped up its naval presence in the region, even attempting to establish covert weather stations on Greenland to support its operations. Even before officially entering the war, the US took decisive action. President Franklin D. Roosevelt expanded America's neutrality zone to include Greenland and the Azores. This move allowed the US Navy to patrol the western Atlantic, report German ship locations to the British, and, in effect, placed the US in an undeclared war with the Axis powers. Roosevelt's administration understood that controlling Greenland was crucial, not just for the war effort, but for America's long-term security. On the first anniversary of Germany's occupation of Denmark, Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, signed a landmark agreement with Henrik Kaufmann, the Danish ambassador to Washington. The deal authorized the US to defend Greenland and construct military bases on the island. But there was a catch. Kaufmann acted without the approval of Denmark's occupied government. Despite their protests and attempts to recall him, Kaufmann stood his ground. He became known as the Good Trader, understanding that securing Greenland was vital to defeating the Axis powers. Interestingly, Roosevelt didn't view this agreement as a stepping stone to purchasing Greenland. Instead, it affirmed Danish sovereignty with one major condition. The US could maintain a military presence on the island for as long as both sides deemed necessary to ensure American security. This clause, known as Article X, would prove crucial in the years that followed. As the war ended and the Cold War began, the US saw the Arctic in a new light. Greenland wasn't just a wartime outpost anymore. It was a frontline defense against the Soviet Union. American military strategists identified the Arctic as a likely route for Soviet nuclear attacks, making control of Greenland essential. Denmark, now a NATO ally, played a key role in the US defense strategy. By 1951, the two nations reaffirmed and expanded their original agreement, ensuring that the US could continue operating military bases, intelligence stations, and Coast Guard facilities on Greenland. Over the decades, this agreement has been repeatedly renewed, most recently in 2004, allowing the US to maintain vital early warning radar systems, a 2-mile-long airstrip, and access to the world's northernmost deep water port in Pituffik. This history highlights a recurring theme. When geopolitical tensions rise, great powers look to the Arctic. Whether through land purchases, strategic agreements, or outright occupation, nations have long fought for control of this frozen frontier. The US, Russia, and even Germany have all sought to secure their Arctic footholds through any means necessary. But here's the problem for President Trump. In the past, acquiring Arctic land was either a straightforward purchase, like Alaska in 1867, or an agreement shaped by wartime necessity, as with Greenland in World War II. Today, Trump may have the political backing to pursue Greenland, thanks to his influence over the GOP and rising security concerns about Russia and China. But unlike in previous cases, Denmark has no intention of selling. A mix of national pride and a new political reality makes this different from past land deals. Greenland's indigenous community now has a voice in these decisions, something that wasn't the case in earlier territorial negotiations. Denmark, after years of neglecting Greenland's autonomy, is unlikely to bow to US pressure. Instead, history suggests that strong alliances and mutual agreements, not unilateral purchases, will be the key to maintaining American influence in the Arctic. The challenge for Trump? His entire foreign policy approach has been built on rejecting these very alliances. If he truly wants to counter Moscow and Beijing in the Arctic, he may have to embrace something he has spent years dismissing: diplomacy.